Hello, welcome to Jason the Old Millennial. My name is Jason, speaking to you here in my basement in the great state of Kansas. Today's video, I'm continuing my series on ranking 100 favorite albums according to when I made this list back in 2021. And so now we're to my top 10 favorite albums. Yes, we got into my top 10. So these are pretty big ones for me, ones that I've loved a lot. And so number 10, a pretty big one. I think you've heard of it, and it is Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys. Pretty obvious top 10 for most people, and I'm no different. I do love me some Pet Sounds and do think it's not overrated. It's definitely a very rated album as one of the greats. So here are my thoughts here on this video on Jason the Old Millennial. Hello everybody, hope everybody's doing well here on a Monday afternoon. Hope you had a good weekend. So I need to try to finish this series this year. I've been doing this for 2 years, I feel like, doing my top 100 favorite albums. And since then, my list has changed so much because I've listened to so many new musicians and albums, done a lot of deep dives lately that I definitely have to change my list at some time in the future, but that's for a future problem. For right now, we'll still continue my what I have on my list at the moment. And a lot of these are going to always be on my list because they're just some of my favorite. And yeah, so like I said, number 10. So number 10, favorite album, Pet Sounds. Yes. Obviously, a lot of people have this pretty high on their list. I know Sam St. John has this, I think, his number 1 favorite album. Scott from Sound Lab Studios, I think this is also in his top 10. And maybe even Breyer, I'm sure this is like high up on his list as well. But yeah, obviously, it's critically praised, one of the most critically praised albums of all time. Does very well on any list. Any list you see, this is like a top 10 album. So it's pretty, for me, it's a pretty common, it's pretty, predictable, I guess. It's a pretty predictable album put in here, but I'm pretty predictable a lot of the times. I do love the good albums that everybody likes for the most part. And this is the record here. And here's the back, which is interesting. It's a lot of photos. They're like in Tokyo because there's a kimono there and stuff. But kind of picture there. It's called Pet Sounds, even though I don't think there's not a song called Pet Sounds, and there's not a lot to deal with pets. But it's kind of an iconic photo. I think they decided on Pet Sounds. I don't think even Brian Wilson wanted Pet Sounds. Somebody decided on Pet Sounds. No, there's a Pet Sounds song. Sorry, I totally forgot. Maybe, yeah, it's towards the end of the album. So yeah, they named it off of that. And you got this, and then they went to like a place there were goats and they're feeding goats, and they took that picture. Interesting picture there. But yeah, what you can say about Pet Sounds? Why is it so iconic? It's been in the Rolling Stones number 2 spot in their 500 favorite albums for last 10 years or more. Yeah, it's the Beach Boys is one of my favorite bands. Their harmonies are absolutely fantastic. They have so many great fun songs. I would like to do a deep dive on them, except that they have like 50 albums, so it's going to be a really hard one to do. And I know a lot of their later stuff is not very good. So definitely their 60s stuff is just phenomenal, though. And this is the only album I actually own from them, and the only one I'm really that familiar with the Beach Boys. To be honest, it's something I need to listen more into, their albums, kind of get more into. But if you know kind of the history behind this album, it's a lot of interesting kind of history. It came out in 1966, by the way. It's their 11th studio album. So, I mean, they're already, of course, one of the biggest bands in the world and in America at this point. And the Beatles are just now becoming the biggest band, or they have been the biggest band for a couple of years now. But Beach Boys is probably right there, right behind the Beatles as one of the most popular bands out there. And yeah, so already had 10 studio albums. They've had tons of huge hits. Their albums do very well and all this. And then you get to this one, and this album. You get to this one. If you're going through their albums, it just feels a little bit different. Like something's different about it, I think, and that's why it's heralded so much. At the time, in the '60s, Brian Wilson, who plays bass and is kind of their lead songwriter, I'd say, and I don't know, sings as well. They all kind of take turns, I think, singing songs, and they all write, but he's kind of the main writer, I think, of the band, and kind of the leader of the band, it seems like, in some sense. And he, of course, we know he went through a lot of mental issues, and also he was doing drugs. I think he's definitely smoking marijuana, probably doing LSD. Drugs are definitely taking effect on his brain. And they were somewhat abused by their father. He was kind of over, you know, controlling of the band and his decisions. And the best thing they did was get rid of him, basically, as kind of their manager, because he was not good for them. And I feel like for Brian Wilson, mentally, he was kind of abusive to Brian, and that took a big effect on him. And he was also having these issues, I know, where he was hearing things that weren't there. Like he was having some, I forget what they call it, but he's having some issues with that. Anyways, he had a big issue just before this, I think '64. He was on a plane and he had a huge nervous breakdown, and was just, screaming, laying on the floor, screaming on the plane. And you can see this in the movie Love and Mercy, which is a really good biopic of kind of Brian Wilson, starring Paul Dano, in the earlier parts anyways, which are really good. It's a really good biographical movie, depicting scenes like this. You kind of see what happens. And after that, he kind of decided to quit touring with the band, and he really wanted to concentrate on just writing and producing the music and trying to make the best music possible. He had pretty grandeur ambition. He was very ambitious in that way. Yeah. So then, and that wouldn't. I don't think the other band members liked that too much. He quit the touring, so they had to get a session bass player to go along with them on the tours. And they got like Glenn Campbell played with them for a little while, which was pretty cool. And Bruce Johnson kind of became somewhat of another member of the Beach Boys later on. And there's some other guys that did touring with him. So at this point, he was not touring with them, and he was just writing music. And a couple things happened. The Beatles came out with Rubber Soul in 1965. And I believe it's Rubber Soul. That's the one that Brian Wilson heard it and was like, oh my, this is like the best album I've ever heard in my life. And there's something kind of interesting about the music industry at this time, where the companies weren't really, I feel like record companies weren't really concentrating on creating the greatest album. Let's put the greatest songs on this album, really create, a monster album. They're more like, all right, we're going to have some hit singles out there. We're going to put the hit singles out there on, the 45s. And then we're going to have an album that's going to have maybe one or two hits. And then the rest are just filler songs. A lot of times they just filled it with cover songs and whatnot. And so a lot of times you hear a lot of these early '60s, and a lot of their albums aren't particularly that great, just because they didn't really concentrate on making a great album. I think they're just more interested on making great singles, and the singles was really what's driving the industry. And in my opinion, the Beatles kind of changed all that, when they made, of course, their early stuff is great. I think Please Please Me is great. Of course, Hard Day's Night, Help are just amazing albums. But then you get '65 and we get into Rubber Soul, where the Beatles are spending more time in the studio than they did before, and creating music that was kind of impossible to make, do live. They're kind of like, hey, we're just going to do music that they can only do in the studio, and we're just going to produce these amazing, songs. And so Rubber Soul felt like the first album. It felt like at that time that was like, oh, here's an album where we're just going to make a great album. We're concentrating on making a great album. And we're more interested in making a great album than just making great singles. And we're going to have an album where there's not going to be filler cover songs. It's just going to be all originals, and they're all going to be, some of their best work at the time. So Rubber Soul comes out, and just, I think, is a phenomenal album, of course, and changed, I think, how we do albums at that time. And I think Brian Wilson really saw that. Of course, he heard that album, was like, man, this is like the best album ever. I need to step up my game, and I really want to come up with an album even better. You know, I want to be like the Beatles, come out with the greatest album, you know, create an album where I write all the songs, you know, spend a lot of time writing, producing, you know, making the best songs as possible, and making a whole album full of these great songs, and not having any filler songs, no cover songs, just straight out, just the best stuff. Anyways, and spending more time in the studio and doing that. Anyway, so Rubber Soul really inspired him to try to make the best Beach Boy album possible. And you can see that, I guess there's two other albums right before this that you kind of see transitioning. The Beach Boys are transitioning into this album. Because if you listen to like Beach Boys, I mean, it's great, but it's all like this just very fun, you know, pop songs. Not a lot of substance, I feel like, behind the songs, not a lot of deep meaning. It's a lot of, hey, let's go out and surf. Hey, let's go see, hey, look at the girls. Hey, you know, we're going to school. We're driving our cars, you know, we're partying, you know, we're having fun, you know. It's very fun songs and everything. And there's some good deep stuff in there, like In My Room and Don't Worry Baby, I think are absolutely amazing coming up to this. But it definitely feels so much different once you get the Pet Sounds, because Pet Sounds in total, it doesn't talk about cars, it doesn't talk about surfing, you know, it doesn't talk, you know, it's the songs are very deep meaning. You can hear it in the lyrics and in the singing style and everything. It just feels deeper and more, type of album, you know, and I think that makes a big difference in this album, because when you get to this and it's like, oh man, this is just, I mean, they're great. They're pop. They still got the poppiness to it. There's still the harmonies and everything, for sure. But then there's some songs where it's like feels just deeper. It just feels there's more to these songs than on their other albums. I think that helps the album a lot. But yeah, so Brian Wilson quits, you know, touring, and he's just writing. And he actually meets a guy named Tony Asher, who's 26-year-old lyricist who writes jingles for advertisement. And he met him through another friend who said he's a pretty good writer. And so Brian Wilson kind of came with the idea like, I'm going to bring him in and as a writing partner, do something, you know, he wanted to do something different, I think, than just writing with the other Beach Boys. And so him and Tony Asher wrote all the songs on this album, pretty much, except there's a cover song. Sloop John B, I believe, was a cover song. Interesting enough, it's one of their best songs of all time. One of my favorite songs of theirs. And maybe, I think maybe Mike Love contributed in some writing, but mostly Brian Wilson and Tony Asher writing all the stuff. And so it almost feels like a Brian Wilson solo album. Even when I did the research, it was almost like Brian Wilson was doing his own solo album here, because he was pretty much in control of everything. And the Beach Boys are out, you know, the rest of them were out, you know, touring and all that. And he was doing all this. And then the Beach Boys' only contribution, I say Beach Boys, the other members of the Beach Boys, the only really contributing to the album was their vocals, of course. He brought them in and he had them do all the vocals, and still got that Beach Boy harmony in there. But they didn't do any of the playing. Brian Wilson got all session musicians, and of course he got a big studio, and he got like tons of, you know, violin players and drummers and horn section and all different kind of instruments he kind of filled in there, and spent a lot of time, a lot of takes, you know, trying to get the perfect take on these songs. But yeah, him and Tony Asher wrote all these songs, and yeah, and this is kind of this period where like Brian Wilson's kind of coming off of Phil Spector's, you know, Wall of Sound. So Brian Wilson's doing his own Wall of Sound. And I know when people talk about this album, it's one of the best produced albums of all time. People say Brian Wilson, and this is where you get Brian Wilson's kind of the music genius out of this album, I feel like, especially because of how he produced the album and how he mixed in all the sounds and everything in there. And really was something kind of revolutionary at the time that he was doing. But yeah, so I added all into what comes the iconic album for them. Interesting, like he become maybe more over controlling. I know he kind of annoyed people with he kept having to do same take after same take, and the other Beach Boys I think were kind of annoyed with him. And I think even when he came this album and he kind of, you know, showed the album to everybody, I think the other Beach Boys were kind of, I don't know, this is like different than our other stuff. And it was almost this feeling of like, if this doesn't work, then, you know, we need to go back to what we do best, and, you know, and just put out the same, you know, poppy stuff. And so it was, so it's definitely different for them, definitely a risk for the Beach Boys in a sense, but definitely over time has paid out. Like I said, it's critically considered one of the greatest of all time. At the time it came out, it did hit number 10 in the US and number 2 in the UK, which is like, okay, it's top 10 in both countries. Yet I always read like it felt like this was not a huge hit when it first came out. That critically it was not as praised when it came out, And I think there was a feeling of the other Beach Boys thinking like, okay, we took a risk here and maybe it didn't work and maybe we should go back to the old days or something like that. But I think Brian Wilson kind of was still fueled to try to continue to write, these great albums and stuff like that and continue on this, though mentally he couldn't, keep on doing it. They had 3 singles come out of here. Caroline No, which went number 32 in the US. Sloop John B was their biggest hit out of here. Number 3 in the US, number 2 in the UK, so pretty big. And then Wouldn't It Be Nice, also a really huge hit for them. Number 8 in the US. God Only Knows, the considered the greatest song on here. It didn't go out as a single, unfortunately. So we don't have, that should have been like a number 1 single to me. And even Sleep on John B, I can see as a number 1 single. But definitely, there's 3 big singles out of here. I mean, I'm saying 3 big songs out of here. God Only Knows, Sleep John B, Wouldn't Be Nice are 3 songs that have been played on the radio ever since I started listening to music. I mean, way before I listened to music, but I've known it since was a kid and I was listening to oldie stations. Lots of Beach Boys songs, and these 3 definitely were played quite a bit. So those are the huge ones on here. But even the other ones you don't know, there's a lot of good hidden gems here as well. Caroline No's not one that I remember hearing on the radio a lot, but man, it's a fantastic song on here as well. But yeah, You Still Believe in Me, That's Not Me, it's great. They're all really good, though. It's a great album. That's why it's my top 10 favorite albums of all time. I Just Wasn't Made for These Times. Yeah, just absolutely fantastic lyrically. And again, you get that great Beach Boys sound that I absolutely love. The harmonies there. And throughout the whole album, a lot of catchy numbers and stuff like that. And a lot of slow numbers, even some more ballads here. But yet they're just absolutely beautiful. Just the sound is just so beautiful. The voices, the instrumentation and everything, just so well done that it's an album that I listen to, and there's not a bad song here, really. I mean, I think maybe Pet Sounds maybe the weakest song here. But even then, it's just one beautiful song after another, and there's some absolutely huge hits. Some of my favorite songs of all time are on here. So that's why it's got to be a 10 here, a 10 out of 10 album. Because you have some of the best songs ever, plus the songs I'm not as familiar with are still pretty darn good. So you can go through this whole album and just go, man, there's not a song that you're gonna skip for me. I listen to every song, and go, man, that's good, and the next song, that's good, that's great. So it's one of those albums that you just love to listen to because every song works for me, anyways. But yeah, so it feels like the album critically wasn't that praised at first. Of course, the Beatles heard it and they're like, "Oh wow!" Even I think at the time, Beatles, John Paul, whatever, I think Paul especially heard it and was like, "It's like wow, that's an amazing album. Like that's one of the best albums we've ever heard." And inspired, I think, them. Of course, they come out with Revolver after that, which is another absolutely fantastic album. But then after that, in 1967, you have Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. So I feel like that's the album that I feel like almost like. Rubber Soul inspired Brian Wilson to write Pet Sounds, and then Pet Sounds inspired Paul McCartney to write Sgt. Pepper's, because Paul McCartney kind of was the mastermind behind Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and I think wrote most of the music there. And so they come out with that, and of course that's one of the biggest albums of all time. 1967 especially, it was the biggest album of that year, won the Grammy Album of the Year, all this, and to this day is considered, one of the greatest albums of all time. So Sgt. Pepper comes out, and then Brian Wilson hears Sgt. Pepper's and is like, man, that's even better than the other albums. Like, now I got to make another album to try to top Sgt. Pepper. So there's this very interesting thing where Brian Wilson's trying to top the Beatles. The Beatles are trying to top Brian Wilson. And then Brian Wilson's supposed to come out with another album, I think, called Smile or something like that, was the next album that he was working on. But unfortunately, all the mental issues he was having kind of, I should add, he also wrote Good Vibrations. at this time as well. And Good Vibrations is one of the greatest Beach Boy songs of all time and one of my favorite songs of all time. I mean, so absolutely amazing song. Good Vibrations comes out as a single. I don't know if it's during this time or after this time. And so it's like, man, if you could have got Good Vibrations on this album, oh my gosh, like that would have made it even higher maybe on my list. I mean, if that is possible. But yeah, so I mean, he was just writing some of the greatest stuff. Right there. Like I said, Brian Wilson's considered a genius for this album. I think you say Brian Wilson's an absolute music genius, and you know it's hard to argue when you listen to this album. Yeah, he kind of masterminded basically. Um, but yeah, so he was going through a lot. He was drugs, you know, issues with the father. He was hearing things. Anyway, so all this mental stuff kind of eventually he had, you know, probably nervous breakdowns and all that. And he went through this period where, I think it's known, there's this period where he like just laid in bed all the time and he grew this big beard. I think grew his hair out. And he was still even making music at that point, but nothing as iconic as this. This was like kind of the last iconic thing Brian Wilson would do with the Beach Boys. And the Beach Boys had to go on without him, and they did some more albums, a bunch more albums without him, basically. I think he maybe contributed a little bit to other stuff, but he was kind of out at that point. And he did some solo stuff, I believe, after this as well, but nothing nearly this big. So this is like Brian Wilson's, you know, this is his album. This is his genius at work. And because of that, it's a top 10 album for me and for most people. Unfortunately, eventually he got out of that rut that he was in. And but it's still, to this day, of course, he still had huge mental issues. And unfortunately, his wife passed away just this last week. So that's not going to help towards his mental issues that he unfortunately has. But very unfortunate, but man, did he come up with some great music that I absolutely love to hear. Oh yeah, I should go with my top three before I end this. Top three favorite songs. It's the three big hits off here. I mean, it's obvious. They're some of the greatest Beach Boy songs of all time. That's why this is such a great album, because all these great songs on there. Number three, I went with "Wouldn't It Be Nice." I mean, that opening dun 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 dun, then drum beat, boom. Wouldn't it be nice? Like, oh, it's just a great intro. Hits you with those great harmonies, and especially high harmonies. What I love about the Beach Boys, not only they have harmonies, but they hit some incredible high notes, and they harmonize on those high notes. And no one else, there's a lot of other great bands that harmonize, but nobody hits those high notes quite as good as the Beach Boys in harmony, I think, which makes them unique, I think, sounding compared to even other great harmony bands. But yeah, Wouldn't Be Nice, super catchy, talking, and even lyrically, it's great, talking about, you know, someday in the future, you know, we'll get married, and that has that part, we will get married, wouldn't it be nice, ba, 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 like, oh, so good, like all, lyrically, the way they arrange the music, harmonies, I mean, it's definitely one of the great Beach Boy songs to me, one I never get tired of. So yeah, number three, Wouldn't Be Nice. Number two, I'm going with Sloop John B, another just absolutely fantastic. Again, it's like a cover song where they're going like on a trip, and then he doesn't like the trip, and he keeps talking about wanting to go home and all this stuff. And so it's somewhat of a song that tells somewhat of a story, seems like. But again, when they get to that chorus and those harmonies are so good. Sloop John B, dun 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 dun. Great melodies, obviously. I believe this is like a song that maybe Al Jardine suggested they do or something like that. So he seems like the one that you need to credit a lot with kind of coming up with this idea to do Sloop John B. But I feel so something, I want to go home. Sloop John B. I mean, like, just those high harmonies are so good. Super catchy, great song. Sloop John B, number two. Number one is the number one song for most people that I've heard ever talk about this. It's and be honest, this is like in my top 10 favorite songs of all time. And that's God Only Knows. And I've loved this song since I was a kid. I remember being a kid and I would hear, you know, Beach Boy songs, you know, and there's so many, you know, California Girls is, you know, a huge hit. Seemed like that was on the radio quite a bit. But you have all these different surfing songs, and Sloop John B, Wouldn't Be Nice was definitely on there a lot. And those are considered, and Good Vibrations, probably considered like maybe their greatest song. I don't know, but I remember at a young age hearing God Only Knows and thinking, wow, this song is my favorite Beach Boys song ever since I was a kid. And I didn't know if that was a hot take or not, but now I don't think it is. I think everybody agrees with me. God Only Knows. But I just remember as a kid just going, that line, God only knows what I'd be without you. I was like, that is such a great line. I just always loved that line, one of my favorite lines. And even I know people say like the whole first part, of it even says, we might not be together, uh, I think the first lines of the song is about, like there's a chance, it might not work out, which was very interesting to say that in kind of a love song. It feels like a love song, but at the same time, it's just like a song where it's like, are they breaking up? Like, I'm not sure what's going on here. If it's a great love song or if it's a song about being broken up or whatever. But lyrically, like I said, I love the, lines of like, um, uh, I'm forgetting, I didn't look them up, but, about like, if we're not together, I will still keep going on, or I still go living, but without you, how good would living be? I'm paraphrasing because I'm forgetting the lyrics out of my head, but beautifully sung. I think not by Brian, but I think maybe by Carl, maybe saying it or something. Just beautifully sung, really great vocally, I think. And then you get that part. God only knows what I'd be without. God only knows what I'd be. Woo! Like when they do that part, where it's like this, they're singing three different parts at the same time, and it's just them kind of almost a cappella, just singing these three different parts, and they're harmonizing. It's just Beach Boys at their greatest, in my opinion. Like that part is just like just pure delight. That moment, but yeah, just lyrically, vocally, instrumentally, it's just one of the greatest songs of all time, in my opinion. So number one, God Only Knows. So yeah, it's my top three. Definitely check this album out if you haven't. If you haven't, then what are you doing? You gotta check Pet Sounds out. And I think some people might. It seems to be a bit overhyped. I can see someone listening going, "Oh, this isn't as good as everybody's saying." To be honest, first time I heard it, I thought maybe this album was a little overhyped. But as I kept listening to it, I was like, man, this is a fantastic album. These songs are all hitting, and the top songs are some of the greatest. So yeah, I kind of came around and be like, yeah, this is not overhyped. This is a fantastic album, like everybody says. But yeah, anyways, that's my opinion on it. Please feel free to comment and give me your opinion on this album. Is it in your top 10 as well? Love to read anybody with their thoughts on the Beach Boys and their favorite song and all that. Yeah, so thank you to everybody who's watched this video. Thank you for anybody that's liked it. And I just want to thank all my subscribers for supporting the channel. I appreciate all of you, and I hope you have a good day.